I am excited to welcome you to our keynote lunch address, which is titled 15 Years of MTSS, What We Have Learned to Help Us Work Smarter. And I am honored to introduce Dr. Amanda VanDerHeyden, one of my inspiration leaders, who has really guided me towards best practice time and time again. She is a policy advisor and thought leader who actively conducts research focused on improving learning outcomes for students. In addition to publishing nine books, over 100 scholarly articles and chapters, she regularly delivers webinars, panel and keynote sessions, including addresses to state school psychology associations and state departments of education in 35 states, Singapore, and China. She has served as a standing panel member for NIH, IES, and the U.S. Department of Education, an advisor and reviewer for NCII, USAID, and IRS Center, the Dyslexia Foundation, and numerous state departments of education. Dr. VanDerHeyden has also served on a number of boards, including the RTI Advisory Board for the National Center for Learning Disabilities and SEDL, one of the 10 regional laboratories funded by the U.S. Department of Education. Dr. VanDerHeyden has authored a number of policy guides and position statements and delivered testimony on the use of MTSS and RTI to identify students for special education. She is credited with developing models of academic screening that are widely used in school, conducting innovative research in mathematics screening and progress monitoring using mastering measurement, and the creation of Spring Math, which I personally have used and love. Dr. VanDerHeyden is president of Educational Research and Consulting in Fairhope, Alabama, and has a faculty affiliation with the Wheelock College of Education at Boston University. She is highly accomplished and impressive, and I'm so excited to hear everything that she wants to share today. So I will hand that over to you.
Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen and get going here. So, because I know I have to stop at 12:55 sharp Central Time. Yes, and I will. I'll be good about that. Okay, and I cannot see the chat. I've got my HOVA app open, but if I will answer questions following the session for sure. But Lauren, please feel free to interrupt me to say, oh, we've got a thematic concern. I just go ahead and interrupt. It won't bother me a bit. My contact information is right here on the slide, the front slide. If you have any sort of follow-up comments or questions that you didn't want to share over HOVA, feel free to reach out. I'm kind of terrible about email. In fact, I didn't put my email on there, probably because I'm terrible about email, but I'm pretty good on Twitter. So always reach out on Twitter or reach out through the Spring Math site, and you can get me that way too. Okay, I have we only have 55 minutes, so I have really 3 key messages for you today. We really have learned so much in MTSS research in the time that I've been doing this work. And these are kind of 3 high leverage thematic ideas that you can take away and hopefully change what you're doing for more efficient, more effective traction in this MTSS work that we are doing. And the themes are this: be more efficient and accurate assessors. We need to be more discerning in the way that we collect assessment data so that we are collecting less of it, interpreting more of the data that we have collected, and acting on those data, because you will never assess your way to better outcomes for students or more equitable outcomes for students. The only way you will get there is intervention. So assessment has to be about enabling instruction changes, intervention, intensification, or it's all a waste of time. Universal class-wide intervention, if you do not use it, it will change your life. We now say in our work that really in the triangle of MTSS, it's not a question mark anymore. It is tier 1.5, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, retool your intensification plan. I mean, longer, louder, meaner, it doesn't work. That's sort of where we started. Give people longer sessions for a longer duration of time. multiple weeks, and that reflects a more intensive intervention. It's not true. Great little spoiler alert, you can actually use small group intervention and get the same effect as you might get one-on-one. So one-on-one is not necessarily more intensive. I will tell you what is. I will tell you a way to think about intensification differently. So I really want to start with this idea, because I can't believe we are still saying this. And this for me came from an article that was written by a guy named Fred Keller in 1968, and I am paraphrasing what Dr. Keller said, but the paraphrase is this: the learner is never wrong. So it turns out learning is the most predictable outcome of highly effective instruction. And another quote from another hero of mine, Kent Johnson, would say, teaching is not telling. And many teachers still feel like if I open the book to the right page and I tell the content that is the target for the day, then I have taught. And I have news for you: that's not effective instruction. The definition of effective instruction is instruction that produces learning when it is delivered for students, and that is knowable, that is measurable, and that reflects helping children meet these very important milestones as they go through their K-12 experience, which means risk is a very, very knowable, predictable, actionable thing. We can see it. We know when there is risk, and there's no need to keep asking or saying, let's verify this risk further. If you see risk, that risk is real, and it is time to begin to figure out how to remediate. In math, it looks like this. I mean, these are just sort of the mathematical milestones that children should hit at these different age or grade levels. And if they don't, chances are you could go back and find out they were probably at risk for some time. So a lot of kids fall off this cliff of misunderstanding around grades 5 and 6 when we start talking about proportions. But in fact, most of those children had deficits that we could have detected if we were looking, in terms of being very facile with multiplication as repeated addition and division as solving for an unknown factor, and their place value understanding. So we sort of probably knew it was coming, and that's what this picture shows you, okay? My favorite article from 2019, Kuhn and Davis, Florida Center for Reading Research, happens to be a math study. They looked at course sequences that children took in Mississippi, very large IES funded study. And they were trying to see if it made a difference. So did children in an advanced math track in high school have a higher probability of meeting the college readiness benchmark on the ACT? And what they found is that it didn't. I mean, that is sort of like shocking. So I'm going to say that again. It didn't matter if children were enrolled in advanced course sequences in math in high school, or even remedial track sequences in high school, in terms of their likelihood of meeting the college readiness benchmark on the ACT in math after you corrected for what they could do in terms of their 5th grade math performance. So I've put this out in worldwide, and I've had people sort of misunderstand this and come back and say, well, are you saying course sequences don't matter? No, I'm saying that the message from ACT and the message from a lot of thought leaders is make more rigorous content available to children and push them into it. We've seen that happen. That's the trend now, right? Is make this available. What I'm saying is that's not enough. So unless you have done the work to establish the foundational proficiencies, which we can measure, and they look like 5th grade math performance, if you have not done the work to make children ready to profit from the more advanced instruction that they're going to encounter, then you're not really going to move the dial in terms of their capacity to thrive and have all of the economic doors open for them that math proficiency can bring through college enrollment and completion. Let's see. Okay, so that's the sort of like, oh, it's tough. We've got risk. We know what risk looks like. If children are behind by grade 5, then they're in trouble in terms of their ACT performance. All of that is true. And that's true in reading too. And that's really what this graph is showing you. This comes from Joe Torgeson's great data back with Reading First. And what it shows is that well, if grade, it falls along the x-axis here. And so the children who were at risk, this is the dark blue group, remained at risk and fell further behind the children who were not at risk. That's the light blue group, okay? But then here's the wonderful, optimistic silver lining message that I want you to hear. Intervention can close that gap. So if you take half of the kids in the dark blue group and you just give them a good research-based core curriculum in reading, you get this effect. But if you give them intensive, individualized intervention, you get that effect. So the message here is assessment step one, intervention can change this pattern for us. Same pattern in math. These prevention effects that we get from intervention are cumulative over time. And so, you saw that the gap closes here. In math, here's a bar graph, just a different way to look at it. But this is a school in Pennsylvania, grades K1, 2, 3, and 4. And the blue is pre-class-wide intervention, and the orange is post-class-wide intervention in my tool, which is Spring Math. And then we used an external measure. So we used, it should say the Cadence Math composite scores, because that's what it's called now, not Devil's Math. And anyway, the blue is before they had systematic class-wide intervention occurring in all of their classes. And the orange is after they have used class-wide math intervention. And what you're looking at is the beginning of year Cadence Math Score Composite. So what this is showing you is after they've had class-wide math intervention, these first graders are coming in at the beginning of the year, 76% are proficient on the fall composite score. Same thing. So we see these large gains in every grade except for kindergarten, which is a lovely control for the rest of the graph because we didn't work with 4-year-olds. So these children didn't get class-wide math intervention in their 4-year-old year. So we don't really see much of a difference, but everywhere that they got it the preceding year, they brought all that benefit into the next grade level. So this is very meaningful to teachers because you want to say to a teacher, gosh, wouldn't you like to teach these third graders? You're ready to start multiplication because guess what? They came in proficient with everything they needed to understand for K1 and 2, and you weren't having to backfill. So the investment of intervention pays off because it prevents future deficits over time. The other thing is that we're all so concerned about equity. And we should be. And now, I've begun to refer to these gaps that we see as opportunity gaps because that's exactly what they are. If effective instruction is instruction that by definition produces better learning and produces sufficient learning, produces equitable learning, then when we don't see equitable learning across groups, that's an opportunity gap. That's just saying that children are not getting the same opportunity and access to effective instruction. That's the problem with assessment as a mechanism to improve equitable decision-making. It depends upon equitable access to highly effective instruction, which we know is not the case. I hope that by the end of my career, we can't just run free and reduced lunch and have that be the strongest predictor in a school of what the year-end achievement will be. If that is still the case, and when I retire, I will feel like my whole career has been a waste. So I hope that begins to shift. Our goals should be about improving equitable access to highly effective instruction. All children should have access to that. So what this picture is showing you is some data from a randomized controlled trial. Again, I love to study class-wide math intervention, so this happened to be a randomized controlled trial of class-wide math intervention. And what's important for you to know is that this is in the South, and so we had two groups. We had Black children and white children, and we could compare their proficiency before intervention, before we started the study. Groups were equivalent and they were randomly assigned to receive class-wide intervention or randomly assigned to receive business as usual control by class. We did not change who was in classes. These were just the real classes in the school, which were diverse by race, right? And what we saw is that in the control group, the disparity that was observed at baseline remained. So we see this much lower than expected and much lower than sufficient proficiency among Black students in this sample. And we don't see that discrepancy for white students. But do you see the difference between the two blue bars? And then in the orange group, those are the kids who got class-wide intervention after class-wide intervention, the classes that got class-wide intervention. And now we see that that gap has closed. That's what this picture is showing you. So again, you cannot assess your way to closing opportunity gaps. That requires instruction, more effective instruction. We know, I mean, this is a really seminal article written by Rosenstein in 1981. And unfortunately, it really has not changed that much. And of course, the pandemic has not helped, but children really do not get a lot of high quality instructional time at school. They really don't. And everything robs instructional time. I just had a meeting yesterday with some leaders in Pennsylvania, and we were talking about special education and IEP goal setting. And I really appreciated the frank conversation, but what these special education teachers shared with me in this particular context is a lot of times they only have access to students that they are serving, maybe even twice a week. That's it. That's all they've got. They've got 80 total minutes per week to work with students. And during that time, they are supposed to do all of their progress monitoring assessments, which are typically overkill. You're over assessing, which, you know, invites a lot of problem admiration and does not make time for actual instructional intensification, which is what children who are on IEPs who are struggling should be getting, the ICU level instruction that we can provide. It ought to be the strongest instruction that we can deliver in a school context. And what happens is often there are structural barriers in the schedule that are basically causing that to be impossible before anybody has even tried. And I see this all the time. So the seminal findings from Rosenstein, I'm not going to read them to you, but you can read them yourself. You know, they fundamentally have not changed since 1981. There's an awful lot of instructional time that is diminished or absent or unstable, that's the opportunity gap, okay? Now, some children come into school, you know, proficient, and some children come into school non-proficient. And sometimes this is systematic across schools. So for example, if this is the beginning of year reading proficiency, and this is where we need to go by the end of the year, and for the blue school, that's the rate of improvement that they need if they come in roughly at 0. And for the orange school, they really have to get about half the growth of the blue school to land at the same landing place, the same finishing point, okay? The problem too is that oftentimes we see that there are differences between the orange schools and the blue schools. So for example, the orange school might be a school where children are already arriving more proficient, but they also have in place a highly effective core curriculum, an in-school reading coach, 90 minutes per day of English language arts instruction, after-school tutoring options that are free to students. And then in the blue school, where they really, really need more growth, we may see that they only have 60 minutes for reading instruction, a balanced literacy curriculum, or, you know, a non-science-based reading curriculum, and a very, very high special education eligibility rate. This is typical. This is not unusual given what we see. So what we want to be about is using the MTSS structures to change this equation, to bring more stable access to highly effective instruction to more students. That's basically what the whole thing is about, okay? This is a new, it's triangle. Can't have a triangle in an RTI talk, but it's an updated triangle. This is in our second edition of our book, the RTI approach to evaluating learning disabilities. And the main change that you're going to see here, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, is that we are formally placing class-wide intervention as tier 1.5. It's unavoidable now. What we have learned in MTSS research is that we cannot even make accurate decisions about who needs instructional intensification when we have a lot of risk in an environment. And the only way you can really deal with that risk is to deliver class-wide intervention, some type of universal intervention, and use the response of students to that intervention to determine who really needs a tier 2 or a tier 3 intervention. But I want to say that MTSS is not a magic bullet. it's hard work. And my good friend Matt Burns often says that RTI is the worst way to diagnose a learning disability, except every other way. So what he means by that is it's hard work. It's difficult. It's challenging. It's not a magic bullet. It is not something that you can purchase and say, we have adopted this and put it on a shelf. It really requires buy-in and behavior change. And this is a handy little graphic from NCII, which is a wonderful resource, intensiveintervention.org, the National Center for Intensive Intervention group. They have so many wonderful tools that are out there. But what I want to say is you can't just pick and choose what you like. So you can't just say, okay, well, we're going to do reading screening, and maybe we're going to do math screening, and we're going to say we've done MTSS. That's not a complete MTSS implementation, and it will not deliver the results for you. So this is actually a picture of a cake that I wanted to make one time, and then I was a very novice baker. This is several years ago. And I had this brilliant idea that I would cut the sugar in the buttercream frosting. Well, it turns out you can't do that. So this is what I got. That's what I tried to make. That's what I got for real for this big holiday at my house, which was now a family joke, because I messed with the recipe. I tried to take the sugar out of the buttercream frosting. Only a fool would do that. So the same is true with MTSS. So back to our 3 key messages. What must we do for more accurate assessment? What does that look like? I'm going to walk you through it. What must we do for class-wide intervention as a tier 1.5 part of an MTSS implementation? And then what does intensification really look like if it's not just longer, louder, meaner? Okay. So let's talk about screening first. More accurate assessment. How do we go from a sea of children to something like this? Okay. And so clear, these are the children who are at risk. This happens to be a picture from my dashboard, but most dashboards look pretty similar. Especially if you see this, and we know we are seeing that we saw this pre-COVID, but we are definitely seeing this now. So how do we know who's really, really at risk when all of these children are scoring so low on our screener? You have to institute class-wide intervention. Now, what some places will do is they will say, let's use an easier screener to get a more normal distribution of scores. Bad answer. It has no content validity. If your screening is not well aligned with the instructional expectations of your school, you cannot use it for program evaluation. You're giving the wrong message to teachers, because teachers will see what is being assessed and they will aim their instruction in that direction. And so you don't want to just make your screener easier to deal with lots of children being at risk. You also do not want to use just a norm reference cutoff criterion, and I'll show you why, which is what many systems will try to do. What you want to do instead is implement a very standard protocol, 15-minute class-wide intervention using a class-wide peer tutoring arrangement. Have every child actively respond on the right level of task difficulty and monitor progress. Very simple. You can harvest a score directly from the intervention session itself. It does not require new assessment time, and nobody has to have a PhD in statistics and methods to determine this is a child that we need to be concerned about. It becomes very apparent. The median has moved toward mastery. Most of the scores have gained over 2 weeks. And this is the child that we're concerned about. So that would be the child to recommend for intensification of instruction. When you have a high base rate of risk, I'm going to show you the mathematical basis for why your error goes up. So this is a scatter plot really, but I'm going to show you a modeled line of a value called negative post-test probability. And let me tell you what that is without jargon. Negative post-test probability is the probability that a child who has passed your screener will fail your year-end test, for example, okay? So this is a child that you've said, hey, this child is okay, but they're really not. They really need instructional intensification. Given a really accurate screening, so I've modeled it here for you with a sensitivity of 90% and a specificity of 90%, and we generally don't do much better than that in our field. This is what happens as risk in your environment goes up. Okay, so when you have risk climbing in your environment, and all of us do, I mean, if you didn't before, you have it now post-COVID, then this orange line climbs mathematically, is a mathematical unavoidable effect. That's why I can model it for you. So when you reach about 50% risk in your environment, you've got a 10% negative post-test probability. That means 10% of the kids that you say are okay are really not okay. And it only climbs very rapidly from there. So my message to you is, if you've got 50% or fewer kids in your environment showing risk, you can rule kids out based on a static screener. That's okay. If you have 50% or more of kids showing risk in your environment, then you must institute class-wide intervention as part of a follow-up assessment to determine who really needs individualized intervention. Do you have a question, Lauren?
Yeah. Yes, I do. And so several people have asked what a class-wide intervention might look like. So maybe just, I don't know if you're getting to that or not, but just maybe dive a little deeper into what that means.
Yeah, I'm going to walk you through it. I'm about to show you. We're almost there. Okay. What I want to tell you, though, is don't be tempted to say, well, what if we chose a different screener? What if we used a different measure? This pattern holds if your sensitivity is any value and your specificity is any value. It moves a little bit, but the pattern holds. So you don't correct for this problem by choosing a different screener. You don't correct for this problem by adding additional screeners. And this is a picture, this happens to come from one of my articles, that's showing you the negative post-test probability given a high base rate of risk. You're at 19% on this particular screener, of saying 19%, almost like 1 in 5 kids that you would say, they're fine, they don't need intervention, but they actually really do. And the very same screener, when you have used class-wide intervention to lower the base rate of risk, now you've brought your negative post-test probability to 6%. So you do not fix this problem by adding screeners, conducting more screeners, choosing a different screener. You only fix this problem by changing the base rate, which requires systemic class-wide intervention. Okay, so just to finish this, tie this up with a bow in a non-statistics way, non-jargony way, we're back to our original graph. These are the kids who look like they were at risk, and I thought I would tell you what really happened with this real class. So we did class-wide intervention in this class, and those are the 4 who actually needed individual intervention. And what I want to show, the reason I always show this graph, and I can pull hundreds of these because we run this all over the world. So it's easy. I can pull from these. It always works this way, that if you had applied a norm reference cutoff, if you said, let's just work with the bottom 20%, you probably would have picked up these 2, but you would have missed these 2. That is a 50% miss rate in a single class of kids who actually needed intervention. So that is an example to say, don't even be fooled to think that if you're not using class-wide intervention, the worst thing you'll do is burden your tier 3 groups. It's worse than that. You will actually pick the wrong children. So yes, you will burden your tier 3 groups, but you will also miss kids who badly needed intervention. And the way you avoid that, of course, is what I'm going to show you on the next several slides, which is how to do class-wide intervention. If you want more information on screening, there's a variety of resources here that you can access. And of course, Lauren will have all of my slides after this talk today, so they can go up on the site and you can use them as you see fit. So now let me make a case to you about class-wide intervention and why you need it. Well, first of all, the effect sizes are ginormous. This comes from a randomized control trial that we did in 2012. We did some follow-up analyses in 2015. We have another randomized control trial in 2016. Robin Cotting was the lead author. Have been picked up in a variety of other people's research. Like, for example, last year we were included with a study that the Harvard Center for Educational Policy did. We were part of a randomized control trial and got the biggest effect size of the interventions that were considered there. So what I want you to see is that the blue group is the class-wide intervention group on the left, and the red group is the control group. Everybody grew on the proximal measures, but the blue outgrows the red on every measure, of course. And distal measures like the year-end test score, we can see what happened in terms of the percent proficient in the control versus the treatment, the intervention group being class-wide math intervention for all students, for students who receive free and reduced lunch, and for children. Look at the effect for children in special education. That's just remarkable and very gratifying. The other thing is that it can be a very low-cost way to benefit children. So there's something called ICERs, and we don't pay enough attention to this in education, but there are very expensive solutions and there are less expensive solutions. And what we neglect to pay attention to is how much time and resources it takes to implement an assessment, to implement an intervention. And we need to be more thoughtful of that, about that, because when we choose a 50-minute intervention, when a 10-minute intervention could have been just as effective, then we're losing 40 minutes of opportunity costs that we could have brought better benefit to our students. So we need to really be paying attention to ICERs, and ICERs are lower is better. And basically they mean this: it's how much does it cost me to buy one standard deviation of gain on my outcome measure. And in the analyses that people are doing now, which are more sophisticated than they used to be, we are including everything. Every bit of cost, the professional time required to implement, the training time, the space, the salary of the teacher that goes into that time, all of that is included now as part of the cost. And just there is an example, an interesting little takeaway here is that on the left-hand side, these are all researcher developed measures and tools, intervention tools. And on the right-hand side, these are all more commercial ventures. Just kind of interesting. I couldn't even put them on the same scale because they were so different. So it turns out researchers produce some very valuable tools like the PALS model, like Spring Math. We are pretty good at having a very streamlined, low cost, bang for the buck kind of tool. First of all, if you want to try class-wide intervention, I'm giving you a link to get a protocol to do it. In math, to give it a try. If you want to check it out for reading, you could go to the Press Center at the University of Minnesota. They have some wonderful tools for class-wide reading intervention. Let me scoot over here. So what's in a class-wide intervention? How does it work? It must be, I remember one time I was on a board and I mentioned something about instructional calendars, and this guy who was on the board, very smart guy, he does like very sophisticated analytics for the oil industry. And he said to me, "Can you send me an instructional calendar?" I said, "Of course I can." So I emailed it to him and he said, "This is all it is," which, yes, sometimes it's very simple. Well, classified intervention could feel a little bit like that when I tell you about it. You put kids into working pairs, you have a worker and a helper, and then they're going to switch roles 3 minutes in. You give them a controlled set of practice materials that should be relatively easy for them. So you're going to use a static sequence of skills that begin with a below grade level skill. And they're going to work on one skill until the median hits mastery, and then they're going to advance to the next skill as a whole class. Children who fall behind will be recommended for individual intervention, small group or individual intervention. So basically, one worker is working problems, for example, in math, while the helper is listening, following along with their eyes and helping if they get stuck, trying to catch any errors that the worker might make. The worker should be thinking aloud, so they should be saying how they're solving each problem and writing the answers as they go. I can do 8 hours on how to do class-wide math intervention. We've got some great videos showing this in all kinds of classrooms. I'm going to show you a short video in a second in a kindergarten classroom so you can get a sense that it really is not that complicated. So they work for 3 minutes, they change roles, they work for 3 minutes, then they are given an independent practice activity. So they do get the same activity, they're going to work independently, they're going to try to beat their own score from the day before, and at the end of that interval of time, they're going to trade papers, score, and then they're going to get their papers back and correct their errors and explain to their math buddies how they fix their error. So it's a really similar formula for reading. So I've highlighted it for math, but it flows the same way for reading. And then that at the end of the week, the teacher is going to record the score from the scored papers that the students already scored during the intervention. When the median hits mastery, everybody will go up, and the children who fall behind will get recommended for intervention. Let me see if I can, I might not be able to get my video to work. Oh, that's okay. Well, I can show one. If people are very interested in seeing a video, I can just pull one up at the end. So this is an example of what happens. So this is the growth over time. And this is a static sequence of skills that this grade level would be working through. This would be 3rd grade. When the median, that's this sort of dark, heavy line, reached mastery, which is above this green dash line, the whole class is going to move on to the very next skill, which would have, in this case, would have been fact families for addition and subtraction 0 to 20, and then they just continue working. So let me, final thought on class-wide intervention. Let me say it is by design a fluency building intervention. So it is situated as a fluency building intervention, which means you're going to start with easier content than you would expect for that given grade level. So like, for example, this is 3rd grade and we're beginning with a mixed addition and subtraction 0 to 20 activity. So that is really a 1st grade skill in my mind, but we're going to start with that. And then all of these subsequent skills build upon the success of this early skill. That's by design, because you really don't want to use a fluency building class-wide activity for children who never have been taught how to do the skill, which I'm about to show you next. So the next message is retooling your intensification. So, you know, we really used to say, just give it for more time, monitor progress more frequently, work one-on-one, and all of that would be more intensive. And what we've learned is intensification is way more sophisticated than that. So what we really have learned is that these are the things that impact intervention effect, the dosage of the intervention, the sensitivity of the outcome measures that we are using, and how frequently we were able to dynamically adjust the intervention for better success. The scope of our target. I love Brian Ponce's great work that if you have a more narrow scope of target, you're going to get a bigger walloping effect on that outcome. Instructional match, that's what I'm going to talk about today as a concrete example that you can take away. I'm actually going to talk about instructional match and then briefly about dosage. But these are all the elements that we now think about when we think about intensifying instruction. And one really critical takeaway is to sort of make peace with the fact that differentiation is just not enough. And this has sort of become like the new learning styles conversation at a cocktail party. And people will, you know, people love to talk about differentiation. Teachers will say, that's my plan. And I always say, if that is your plan for your MTSS intervention, you're really dead in the water, because differentiation in and of itself is not enough. And we know this. It's a really well-controlled IES study that is cited right here. And the takeaway is going to tell you that even though these teachers were trained to use the map to differentiate, they were monitored to be sure they differentiated according to how they had been trained to do it. It really did not produce any effects on year-end reading achievement for the children in this study. So what is that about? Well, I would say, first of all, it's really hard to do. And what ends up happening in many systems is that there's a big analysis of data up front. Children get sorted and there they stay for way too long period of time. Nobody's really paying attention to how they change from week to week. The process is not dynamic enough for it to truly to verify that children are remaining aligned with the right type of instruction week in, week out. It's too complicated to shuffle kids so much. So we won't talk about personalized learning today because we don't have time, but we're going to focus on, well, then on this far end of the continuum, my definition of what is really intensified individualized intervention, I define it like this. We are now differentiating and customizing instruction in the context of local learning expectations, ongoing progress monitoring, implementation, management, and outcomes evaluation over time. So this is a much more involved and managed experience for learners than what might be referred to as simple differentiation. So how does this work? Well, okay, this is a picture of learning. You don't know that. You didn't know that. Doesn't, that's what learning looks like, but it does. All learning looks just like this. So let me tell you what you're looking at. The y-axis is the accuracy of a child's performance on, this happens to be a multi-skill, multi-digit multiplication task. The x-axis is the fluency score. So accuracy is capped at 100%. So you're going to get this beautiful sort of curvilinear pattern. And this would be the same for reading. Actually, I have a graph for reading. It looks just like this. This would be the same for people learning musical instruments. probably learning a sport, learning a foreign language. All acquisition of behavior follows this pattern. And what this is showing you is that well, let me say this, is that all children progress in a new skill understanding from inaccurate to accurate to speeded. That's just how the progression occurs. What happens is most teachers are not timing performance and making decisions about mastery of content before introducing new content. Most teachers are paying attention to accuracy alone, which is really a crummy metric, especially once children become accurate. So what happens here is that teachers find that children over 90% are accurate and are ready for more challenging work. But what we know is that children to the left of this line are in what we call the frustrational range of performance. It's frustrating to be in the frustrational range of performance. Errors are very prevalent. In fact, this is where all of the errors are. Do you see that? So errors fundamentally go away as you move to the right, as your performance becomes more facile, more fluent. Your errors just naturally go away. That pattern is so robust that we don't actually even have to measure errors. All we have to measure is fluency. And if you don't hit our fluency criteria, you are not ready for certain types of instruction. And we know that without making any kind of decision errors, because errors really only occur for children who are in the frustrational range of performance. Okay. Children between these two dashed lines are in what we call the instructional range of performance. And if you give the right instruction when children are in the instructional range of performance, which is characterized by lots of opportunities to respond, so very high quality skill practice, you get this beautiful uptick in performance. So you get your most rapid growth when children are in that instructional range of performance during learning. This phase of learning is also characterized by a high accuracy rate. And then finally, when you are to the right of that dashed line, you're in what we call the mastery range of performance. And this performance is characterized by a high probability of skill retention, flexible, enduring, adaptable skill use. So this is where generalization occurs, skill generalization occurs. So the problem is when a teacher has said all of these children are proficient, what we know is that these children are actually in trouble. If we come back and measure these children, these are all 100% accurate, just like this kid over here is 100% accurate, but this kid over here is way more proficient. And what would happen is if we come back and measure these kids in a couple months, they will not retain the skill, chances are. They will not be able to use this to have faster learning of related but more complex understandings. They will not be able to solve novel problem types or generalize their learning without additional instruction. So this is what we're after. This is the goal of all intervention efforts, is that we want to move children into this side of the performance, really mastery or higher, to move on. This process is referred to as the instructional hierarchy, and it is so robust. It was written about in 1978 by Herring and Eaton, and it's been studied a lot since then. And I do a lot of research in this area. Robin Cotting, Matt Burns, lots of other people do a lot of work in this area. But what it says is that if you give the right instructional opportunity to children when they are in the frustrational range of performance, then you will see performance improve and errors will diminish. And then when you move into the instructional range of performance, as I mentioned a moment ago, if you give the right opportunities to respond, high quality skill practice, performance will uptick. You'll actually get more rapid growth and errors will remain low. And as you move into the mastery range of performance, eventually performance levels off. I mean, this should resonate with you if you do a lot of oral reading fluency. There's only so fast that children will read, and reading faster is not necessarily of greater benefit to the child once you get beyond mastery. So what are the characteristics of instruction that work when children are in the frustrational range of performance? We call this the acquisition stage of learning. And the types of things that work are restricting the task, making it a sort of narrow task presentation, immediate corrective feedback, that's the #1 active ingredient. Elaborate feedback, you might use modeling and cueing in this phase of learning. But once you move into the instructional range of performance, you need to move into fluency building activities. And if you are still using a lot of immediate corrective feedback, more elaborate feedback, modeling, cueing, you will actually worsen learning because you will cost opportunities to respond by that choice. So you need to shift your instruction. Your instruction now needs to be about high dosage of opportunities to respond, delayed corrective feedback, and varying the task and using goals to incentivize more practice, more high quality practice. Once you move into the mastery range of performance, now you want to vary the task. You might have to introduce some corrective feedback if there's a generalization failure, but this is where, your challenge problems live. Your applied work can come in. And I think what happens a lot is that teachers have understandings of tactics. Like in math, we run into all the time sort of like inquiry-based learning or productive struggle, and they say, well, that is supposed to work. Well, I'm here to tell you, no tactic is effective for all learners all the time. Okay, it has to be aligned with their learning needs. And I will say, I think inquiry-based learning and productive struggle get terrible data. They don't show any effects on learning in well-controlled studies, in part because they probably have not been studied with regard to where they might possibly make sense, which would be, for me, as a generalization opportunity. So you have teachers trying to use productive struggle or inquiry-based learning when they're in an acquisition stage of learning, and it can't possibly work there because the active ingredients in an acquisition stage of learning are about establishing correct understanding with the fewest errors possible, right? So to me, inquiry-based learning or productive struggle maybe has some promise, but certainly not as an acquisition tactic, not as a fluency building tactic, but for skills for which children have reached mastery as a very specific generalization opportunity. Now, what happens is this pattern is so robust that if you give the wrong instruction, then you'll get what's called the skill by treatment interaction. Matt Burns famously labeled it that, which is if you give fluency building instruction when children in the acquisition stage, you will actually worsen learning. If you give the right instruction in the instructional range of performance, great, you get this uptick. But if you give acquisition support, that's the immediate corrective feedback, the modeling, the cueing, you're going to get this effect on learning, that skill by treatment interaction, and it occurs in every range of performance. Okay, so that kind of summarizes for you how you can think about student learning as a way to align instructional tactic with student need. And that's what intensification is all about. So actually, let me just skip over this and I'll come right back to that. So if your goal skill is addition of 2-digit numbers with and without regrouping, now you can very logically sample back and identify where is the skill gap. So for example, if you give this measure and children are at mastery, a child is at mastery, say, okay, no intervention is needed. If they are in the instructional range, then you're going to give them a fluency building intervention. If they are in the frustrational range for this particular skill, you might drop down and check a prerequisite understanding. And this will allow you to isolate if, for example, if you take out the regrouping requirement in this task and the child now is at mastery, then that's going to support that you need an acquisition intervention for this skill, which is really going to be focused on the regrouping piece of that understanding. If they're instructional range of performance, you'll give them a fluency building intervention. And if they're frustrational, you'll drop down. That's it. That's exactly how the logic works. And then you take that and you use a category of an intervention that you like. I've given you a row for math and I've given you a row for reading. But if you know that you have a child who needs an acquisition intervention for sums to 12, then you're going to choose one of these. These are all, in our world, we consider these acquisition interventions. If they need a fluency building intervention, then you're going to use something like a timed trial or response cards or the class-wide math intervention, which is a fluency building intervention by design. That's the simple way to make this happen. And then you can use this for organizing your small groups by, if children happen to need the same type of intervention, then they can become a small group. So this is an example of children who are working on missing numbers, and they all happen to need a fluency building intervention. So this week they are a logical small group. They can all work together. But at the end of the week, when we reassess, the group needs to change based on what students need. So like in our tool, we organize small groups for teachers, and you don't have to deliver intervention in a small group, but you can. And one of the important takeaways that I wanted to mention for the tier 2 intervention is that what we now know is that group size is not associated with intensification. So what I mean by that is Chris Dobler and Ben Clark, 2 different IES funded studies, replicated, the first one had a surprising finding to them, and then they replicated it with the second one, which is that they gave small group math intervention in an arrangement of 1 adult to 2 children, I believe, and 1 adult to 5 children. And the 1 adult to 5 children was equally effective as the 1 adult to 2 children, and it was a randomized controlled trial. So what that says is, at least in that range, group size did not matter, which is wonderful silver lining, because you can work with more children in a group and you don't have to assume that it is less intensive. It's not. That's not what the data support. So I mentioned that I would also talk about dosage. So if you figured out what children need, you know where they are in their stage of learning relative to your task and your goal that you're trying to help them reach mastery on. So you know, okay, I need an acquisition intervention, or I need a fluency building intervention. And as they improve, you adjust the intervention to remain aligned and get them to grade level proficiency. So now you have that model. That's intensification. That's individualized, intensified tier 3 or tier 2 support. But dosage also matters. And one of the key findings from the MTSS world over the last 15 years is that more frequent, shorter duration interventions are better. Lots of people have done this work. Schutte, and I believe she was in Oklahoma when she did this, and she published an RCT in 2015 and demonstrated that more frequent, shorter duration intervention was more effective. Other people like Gary Duhan and Brian Ponce have published very similar work. Gary Duhan had just a beautiful dose response curve study demonstrating a similar effect, that shorter duration, more frequently delivered interventions were more effective, produced a stronger, more intensified instruction response for students. And this happens to be a paper that I was an author on. We did a randomized control trial where we randomly assigned children to control condition, a once-a-week intervention condition, a twice-a-week intervention condition, and a daily intervention condition. And what's important to know is that with the exception of the control group, which was just a progress monitoring only group, every other condition, groups were equivalent at baseline. All the procedures were conducted by researchers. Everything that children experienced was identical, and they got the exact same number of minutes in a given week of instruction, with the exact same opportunities to respond, with the exact same rate of feedback, with the exact same rate of praise, and we even monitored their engagement. The once a week got a 48-minute session, the twice a week got 2 24-minute sessions, and the daily was really 4 times per week, and we gave them 12-minute sessions. So it was a 48-minute investment for the week in every group except control, okay? And this is what happened. So the control group looked like this, because children do grow over time in their grade level. The once a week group looked just like the control group. And that made me really comfortable saying to systems, if all you can do is give specialized instruction or intervention once a week, hello, special ed teachers, you're wasting your time. This is not the ICU level of intensification that children need if they are getting tier 3 or IEP level support. It just will not give you the return that you want and parents would want for their children. Okay, twice a week gave you this. Remember, it's the same overall investment of minutes, and this is what you got in the 4 times per week. So again, there's really a pattern, a converging pattern of evidence suggesting very clearly that shorter duration interventions delivered at a higher frequency produce a better return on investment in student learning, bigger effect size on student learning. I don't know Other people are calling it this. I've been calling this microdosing for intervention. And we see this with even like people have reported 3-minute interventions implemented multiple times per day are producing significant gains for students that really are superior to these pull-out 30-minute sessions. So we need to figure out how to make those schedules work for us so that we can enable this much more effective way of delivering intervention for students. Final thoughts. On the left is a high integrity intervention. On the right is a low integrity intervention. We must monitor integrity. We must monitor implementation. You know, you can't train and hope. That has never worked in education. People don't follow diets. People don't follow budgets, and people do not consistently implement academic interventions when they are not being well managed and supported to do that. So we say these are the key questions that leaders need to be paying attention to every single week. And this is the feedback that teachers need. Teachers need to see the results of their growth every single day for the effort, or they will not sustain the implementation. There is no better way to repair learning loss than MTSS. In all of our systems that use my tool, which is the Spring Math tool that I built, we are seeing learning loss recovered across the board, and we're delighted to see it. So the message we say that is one of hope for teachers is, yes, your children are coming in lower. That's reflected with a lower yellow bar over here, but the gains are greater because they're landing in the same place because you're giving them the same high quality intervention. So let's just do that, right? Enable high quality access to stable access to high quality instruction for all learners. Final slide, and thank you for having me, Lauren.
Amanda, thank you so much for all of your thoughts. I think the general consensus is an inspiration to want to learn more about your research and about all the work that you're doing and apply it in their own ways. So there were a lot of questions in the chat that I left for you. I attempted to answer some for you. So feel free, everyone, to come check back in the next few hours. I'm sure there will be answers to your questions. And generally, just thank you so much for your great insights and your time today. And thank you, participants, for joining us. Amanda, did you want to answer one or two questions, or?
Well, I thought I might, because once I close out, I can't ever see these again.
Yes, so you should be able to see them in WOVA, but I will bring one or two to your attention.
Okay.
So one question that they had was for tier 1.5, is there a difference between an intervention and a practice? If something becomes a standard instructional model for the entire class, is it really accurate to describe as an intervention?
Yeah, well, we describe it as an intervention and make a case that it's an intervention because you don't use it in every classroom. You only use it where you have a high rate of risk. So that's why we say it's not really tier 1, but it's not really tier 2. It's tier 1.5, and becomes a part of your screening decision. So it is a necessary feature of MTSS for screening accuracy, but also for being a highly efficient way to improve learning. A statement that I think has run its course in MTSS is the statement of you'll never intervene your way out of a core problem. Okay, I understand where that's coming from. Yes, and I agree, you must pay attention to the quality of core, but I have news for you. If you have a core problem, you can't not intervene your way out of it. You must introduce universal intervention to improve results for students over the short term while you fix whatever's going on in your core program. So I feel like that statement gets overused. You can't just say, well, we can't do anything. We're going to sit back and wait till you fix your core problem. That doesn't work either. So we do think about it as an intervention because it has to be supported and managed. So, I'll use class-wide intervention all over the world, and it doesn't just do itself. So just because you say to teachers, hey, go do class-wide intervention, no, it takes weekly check-ins, it takes graphed feedback, it takes tracking their dosage and their use of that strategy supplying the materials to do it. So it feels more like an intervention than a practice. Anyway, I'd love to, if people have more questions, just reach out. I'm happy to send you info. Somebody asked about flipped classrooms. Oh, I hate them. The data are going to show that that tactic does not work. It's like, it's a fad. It was a fad idea. It is, I think that is going to crash and burn. And actually there was one really good study that did show it did not work.
Nice. And I'm curious to hear more about those studies, because so much of what we talk about is these trends that come and go in education, and something that sounds cool or innovative. And really the message today is, if it's not backed in research and you can't support student outcomes, is it really that effective, right?
Yeah, it's so funny how we have such a disdain for what we think is sort of boring, explicit instruction. You can't beat explicit instruction. And it does not have to be, it just needs a PR makeover. Explicit instruction needs to hire a manager, right? Give it a new name, call it a something, I don't know what, but because people like me name that stuff and we're not clever with that. It's enormously effective. It is not the enemy of creativity. It is not this sort of didactic talking at people. It is absolutely making thinking easier. I mean, one of the things that class-wide intervention does is it is a behavioral practice model for better mathematical thinking. Class-wide math intervention is. So when you're doing math work independently, the worker and the helper is inside your own head. You're doing both roles. So what we've in effect set up is a 15-minute interval where children get to practice both pieces out loud, where it's observable and correctable and shapeable. Right. So I just think sometimes people misunderstand explicit instruction and they think it's just talking at kids, and it's absolutely not. It's really the best way to create generative, creative responding in children. But yeah, flipped classrooms just sounded cooler. And I think it's been a big crash and burn. And I think too, a lot of those edufads that come out, they don't really get evaluated in rigorous experimental arrangements. They get evaluated by anecdote, and probably with children who were going to learn anyway, right? Yeah.
Yep. 100%. I would love to keep talking. Feel free to join us in the Whoever chat. I'm going to keep working on responding to some of the questions. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you, Dr. Van.